Welcome to Data Skeptic Machine Intelligence, our podcast series exploring contemporary topics in artificial general intelligence and large language models. We learned 2 episodes ago that ChatGPT is a little bit better at some programming languages than others, yet still overall very performant on all of the above. We learned last week that despite large language models being, as of today, not very good at certain math skills, interestingly, you can ask them to write a program that will get you the problem, and that seems to shortcut the issue. Without a doubt, tools like Github Copilot are going to make a huge impact on what programming is going forward. I've got my opinion, but opinion's an anecdote. Today we get into some survey results. Several hundred programmers gave feedback about their experience using LLMs as programming assistants. I definitely use it that way. Is it perfect? Not in my experience, but maybe I need to be a better prompt engineer. Let's find out what more people than me think.
I'm Jenny Liang. I'm a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University. I'm currently in my second year. Right now, what I'm studying is I'm looking at the usability aspects of code generation tools. In particular, we've done stuff like user studies, but in the future, I'm really interested in looking at developing techniques so we can better align what developers want with actually what code generation tools like Github Copilot output.
Could you expand on that? Like, I know as a developer what I want, but you can't interview everybody. How do you find out something like what a developer wants?
So certainly, there are many different ways that we might figure out as HCI researchers what developers want. One way is we might conduct observational studies where we look at exactly what developers are doing as they program to kind of maybe infer some of their needs through that way. But the chosen way that we've decided to kind of study what developers want is by conducting a large-scale survey. So this kind of alludes to the study that we're going to be discussing a little bit more in depth today. And so you can ask a wide variety of questions through surveys and try to kind of gather a sense of maybe what snags people are hitting, what challenges they're facing, but also things that they love about the tools that they want to keep. Through that particular method, we've decided to kind of like collect a variety of opinions through higher number of samples to kind of generalize or get a general sense of what people are feeling with regards to tools like Copilot.
Well, we're obviously going to dig into the study, but before we get there, I was wondering if you might mind sharing a few details on your own personal journey as a programmer. Where does that start, and where do you first encounter LLMs and this kind of stuff?
I didn't really start programming until I hit college, actually. So this was maybe in 2015. So back then, these LLMs in the current form certainly did not exist. Before I did my PhD, I spent a lot of time actually really loving programming and wanting to be a software engineer, and in fact, a software architect for a really long time. But as I kind of learned more about software engineering, I realized I became really interested in the process. And so that's how I started kind of diving a little bit more into research. The way that AI itself kind of comes in is I had a little stint at this place called the Allen Institute for AI, where they do a lot of really cool natural language processing research. And I was really fortunate to be one of the folks to kind of like work in that team there. And so through there, I was exposed to a lot of AI concepts and stuff like that. And so I wanted to kind of bridge these 2 different worlds together. And so that's how sort of I ended at this nexus of software engineering, HCI, and AI in particular.
And do you happen to have a memory of the first time you asked an LLM to do some code for you?
I think it might have honestly been with Copilot. I can't remember a particular, like the first time I'd used it, but I do think that the first time I actually tried to incorporate these tools in my day-to-day is with Copilot. And that's probably the tool I use most these days. I haven't used GPT too much for my programming, actually.
We know from our own surveys, the majority of our listeners are programmers, but not everyone is. For those that aren't, and maybe for those that are, sharing a little bit about what is the experience of Copilot? Like, how does it interact with your workflow? Is it useful? How useful? And that sort of thing.
Yeah, so certainly there's 2 versions of Copilot maybe we can talk about. First one is Copilot, and that was released in 2021, I believe around the summer, but that's all, I guess, hearsay. So let's just say it was released in 2021. In that version, what it mainly focuses on is largely code completion. So given, some code that you already have on your IDE, it'll do some completions, both short form, like one-liners, but also longer form completions. At the time, it sort of triggers on its own. It's not really necessarily clear on, it would kind of show up as a suggestion in your IDE, although you can trigger it with, natural language comments as well. There's a new version of Copilot that just came out about 3 months ago called Copilot X, inspired, I think, largely in part by these LLMs like GPT-4 that come out recently. They kind of incorporated more like chat options and things like that. So now the landscape of these AI-powered programming systems looks very different than they did maybe about, even 6 months ago, to be honest. The landscape has been rapidly changing, and I'm much less well-versed on the Copilot X because I have not used it or actually studied it as well in my research. So that's one limitation to my knowledge.
Well, and with the pace of news, you can't always be up on everything in AI these days.
It is. It's tough. I think one really difficult part about HCI research in particular is we're always catching up with what people are up to. There's always, at least a several month lag, if not more, between what's been released, how people are changing their development practices, and like what we learn and can synthesize in academia. So it's a big game of catch up, and we don't always do the best job of keeping up to date on everything, but we try our best.
Well, that's a separate debate on how you speed up that process, but let's jump in, I guess, to the survey approach, because on some level you have to gather data, right? So how do we get some information to study?
There are many different ways that you might do this. In particular, the way that we do it is by looking at people who have been involved in like code generation related repositories like Tab9 or GitHub Copilot. And we just kind of contacted them. Although I will say, full disclosure nowadays, or maybe not even nowadays, but I don't know if that's necessarily the most recommended way actually to do recruitment. And so I would actually, for any other HCI researchers listening, I would encourage to maybe use other platforms like Prolific, which are more like traditional crowdsourcing platforms like Mturk to maybe get your survey out and target developers at the same time. But that's the particular method that we approached with. Through that, we're able to kind of gather a larger number of participants, in our case, 400.
Well, you got a good sample of then a highly targeted, somewhat niche audience, at least when we compare it to the general population. A good opportunity to ask some questions. What did you ask them?
Yeah, so we asked a whole bunch of different types of questions. The questions that we got were actually all derived from a set of smaller scale usability studies, like with 20 developers or so. We synthesized a bunch of different findings from these studies that had been out on Copilot in the initial version of Copilot that I mentioned in like 2021. And I had basically just like found every single usability issue I could possibly encounter through prior literature, and I synthesized them into a bunch of survey questions. So topics might include like how people are using GitHub Copilot or other code generation tools, like why are they using these tools? Like if they're not using these tools, why are they not using them? Other things we also try to look at are like, are people giving up on the code that's generated by Copilot? How are they evaluating the code? Are they understanding the code that's, being generated? And then finally, we also try to kind of capture some like other additional feedback that people had for these code generation tools, as well as like whether they had any like concerns with using them as well.
Well, of the developers that are using these tools, are there any key takeaways for how they're using them?
Yeah, I think for me personally, we had two main findings, although we have a bunch more listed in the paper if you want the actual numbers. I think the first thing is developers find it difficult to kind of control these models or know like what exactly about the input is causing the output. That controllability issue, I think from an HCI perspective, comes to be sort of like, seems to be a little problematic. And especially this is an issue because we notice that the reason why people mostly don't use these tools is because they find that either the code itself doesn't meet certain like functional requirements as in like behaviors, or non-functional requirements like doesn't meet security requirements, maybe doesn't meet the style of the code, etc. In that sense, I think controllability is actually an important concept to kind of capture with these code generation tools. A second thing that we sort of noticed is that the large reason why people are using these tools is because they really resonate with, the ability of these tools to kind of complete code for them. So rather than Copilot's ability to generate like really long snippets of code for them where they're not super sure what to do, it seems like developers more value the ability of Copilot to just complete lines for them, do like shorter completions, things like that. So in prior literature, they've sort of described these two main modes of using Copilot, like acceleration mode versus exploration mode, where acceleration mode is like this idea where, developers use Copilot when they know what they want and it just helps them get there faster, versus exploration mode. It's this more like, I'm really uncertain what I'm going to do. It's a new task. Can you generate like 10 lines of code for me that does this behavior? So it seems like they're resonating more with this first mode of acceleration. So I'd say that's like two central themes that we're sort of seeing in our study. A slowly like emerging theme that we're seeing, which this study was done in like January, right after GPT was released, is I think these new text-based formats of programming assistance. So like GPT, it seems like people were starting to kind of resonate a little bit with that as well. And I think, 6 months, or probably more than this, 9 months later, we're seeing that it certainly seems that, text is maybe a future way of interacting with AI programming assistants, although I have not yet seen studies that have looked at this in super depth. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, you had a reasonable enough sample size that I'm sure you heard both sides of the coin on this. A lot of reasons to use it or ways to use it. Are there any insights as to why developers have not used it or perhaps rejected it as part of their workflow?
I mean, for the most part, what we're sort of seeing is that in terms of not using it, it was largely just performance reasons. Like these models so far either like can't predict what the developers want from like the behavioral side or as in like the code behavior side, or there just were certain limitations in how the models could accommodate for non-functional requirements, right? So that was like the main one. The other reasons that we're noticing that people reported for not using these tools is that it was hard to control the model to get it to say what developers wanted. So that sort of is related to this idea of functionality. I guess like as a somewhat third reason that we're observing is that people find that it takes a long time to debug or even incorporate the code into their own code bases. And prior literature has also suggested that, debugging, reading the code is actually the like number one action that developers spend time on when it comes to interacting with these tools. So that sort of aligns with prior literature as well.
When a developer says, "Oh, I write code all day," that seems very obvious, but it also isn't. And it's like, well, depending on your language, you can be in a dozen different IDEs, or maybe you write it in Notepad or Sublime Text. Like, what it is to be a developer is sort of ill-defined in a way that I think makes it hard to integrate. If we were all in one IDE, there'd be one plugin. What do you observe as you get different perspectives on the ways in which people work?
One, people really loved the ability of Copilot to really be able to work in different languages, right? So some people might be working in one singular language, but there were a few people that actually talked about being able to work across like polyglot languages. So they might be working in like Rust, Java, and like a bunch of different things. And they were like, I really love the ability for me to not have to like know all the syntax or like have to spend time looking it up all the time. Copilot kind of already knows in a general sense like what I want, and I know enough about the language to just like verify at a high level what it does. So it helps them saves time in that particular context, especially. And I don't think that all developers are necessarily working in that particular context. So I think that would be the one thing that jumps out to me there.
Well, they've got a couple of options, and of course, this will evolve maybe quickly. But as of the time of the survey, could you share a few details on what were the most popular tools? Maybe not the best, but the most popular at least.
Sure. I mean, within our sample, what we were observing was Copilot by far, I think, was one of the most popular tools that were reported by just in terms of frequency. But this was also certainly biased by the fact that we were also asking people who were like involved in Copilot related repositories. So certainly some biases there. We also observed some people using Tab9, but again, the same bias applies because we were talking to some Tab9 users. And then other tools like Amazon Code Whisperer, we had put on as an option, but not many people kind of seem to use that. And because GPT was so new at the time, or ChatGPT specifically, we did not leave in a specific answer for people to put in, but there were like maybe 5% of our sample had specifically said like, I use GPT, please, like I would love to share my experience with it. And so it seems like also there's some number of people at the time, even in January, using GPT as part of their development.
Well, if I were some high level executive at some company who, I had spent all my time shaking hands and I didn't get enough familiar with code anymore, I might be pretty concerned to hear that the engineers are now not writing the code anymore. They're giving it up to these language models. To what degree is that fear warranted?
Like I said, to an extent can be true, but I think as you mentioned, software development is more than just writing code. It's being able to understand the requirements that you're given and being able to translate it into more technical implementations, but that's writing. Part of it is also being able to read code, right? Code comprehension is a very important skill within software engineering. There's collaborative aspects where you're trying to say, hey, I'm working on this code, but it relies on this other thing that my teammate knows. And so I think there's a lot more to software engineering than just writing code. And so while, some code writing aspects may be decreased, I think that does not put any less value in the work that software engineers are doing. And in fact, maybe it just changes the way that they do work in the future.
Did you get any feedback from your respondents about like concerns they would have for why the code might not be valid or useful or things along those lines?
So I think in terms of like general concerns, we found a couple of things. We mostly asked a little bit more along like the ethical side or issues of using these code generation tools, like things around like IP or like privacy and security related concerns. So it seems like people were more concerned with the fact that these tools could actually generate code that might infringe on IP, as in the fact that they were trained on like a bunch of code that we aren't super clear where they're coming from. Right. And so there's always that chance that, you might be infringing on someone's IP. Code generation tools then also have access to people's code. So there's a total possibility that if you're working in a corporate or a proprietary context, these tools might totally be able to have access to this information and then use it to fine tune or train these models and then also later generate them. Right. And so that seemed like a concern that people were sort of somewhat echoing within our sample.
It seems like a reasonable concern. Is that something that future work can address, or is that this dirty secret we're going to always have to deal with?
I think future work can address. This is where my expertise is a little bit more limited, but from what I understand, there may be more proprietary versions of these tools coming out. For instance, let's say if you did use some sort of like open source large language model, and then you fine tune on your own data and things like that, and then keep it only within that particular context, I think that would probably be a safer usage or a more valid usage of the tool that respects this privacy or proprietary information. But yeah.
Do you have a thought on where the tooling is going? I mean, we kind of have access to it today, but it's early days. Certainly it's going to look different in the future.
I mean, the study itself specifically focuses a lot more on like code generation, but I think with the release of GPT-4 especially, I think the landscape of where these tools might be going is going to be a lot broader than just code generation, right? We might see them being integrated at all stages of development, whether it's when we're making a pull request, maybe we're like making a merge. We might see them at, like generating test cases, which is actually something that we noted in our survey as well, but perhaps like more sophisticated tools to automate testing and things like that. The world's wide open as to what software engineering might look like with the introduction of these tools. So I think give it a year or two, researchers might have envisioned new ways and also practitioners as well. So I'd love to see where it is. But at the moment, we're all honestly kind of scrambling to figure out all the ways to apply AI to software engineering. So that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I'm personally in a place where I don't necessarily have a good idea. If I did, I should probably incorporate. But I'm just like, hey, world, impress me. But I'm curious from the survey, are there any themes in the things people are asking for in the way they want these to improve?
There is, and I think like they kind of touched in a more interaction perspective. I think one thing that I saw a lot of participants ask for is personalizing these tools. So like I want it to capture my own programming style or capture the style of my project. I think that was something that people had asked for. But also there's personalization in the fact that like, hey, if this generation is wrong, I wish that I would kind of realize when it was wrong and be able to kind of take in that feedback and improve for the future. So I think there's some notion of history and personalization that people would love. I think another thing that some people had mentioned is like wishing that these models were sort of more up to date. So a lot of people were saying like, hey, the code generation tools giving me like deprecated APIs that just like straight up don't work anymore, right? Or it's not accounting for new languages that have come out after the release of Copilot initially. And so I think there's some also like catch up or being able to kind of accommodate for more real time or up to date information that people are also asking for. So there's that. And then the final thing I'd also add is in trying to give feedback, I think some people were a little split about how the feedback should be given, but I think by and large, people wanted something that was like fast and intuitive, that they don't really want to spend that much mental effort into thinking about how to give feedback. Like they just kind of want it to, okay, I didn't like this, so like we can keep moving on. So there was also like that sort of theme emerging from our data.
Are these tools, is this something just like a practitioner uses? Like I went out and bought a better screwdriver? Or do you think these are also sort of like teaching assistants simultaneously?
I think the evidence suggests that it is somewhat a teaching assistant. Even with our preliminary findings with Copilot in its early days in this study, we saw that people were actually trying to use Copilot to like learn new APIs and new languages, which is fascinating because that might actually indicate that you can it's not even just a resource to look up as an API reference, but like it's literally something that people can use to learn new skills and programming languages. So I found that really fascinating. And I think in the future, I would not be surprised if we maybe try to leverage these general knowledge, programming knowledge that these LLMs have to, further down, to further education and stuff like that.
Well, there's a couple different contexts in which I want to kind of ask you for your thoughts and maybe advice. Maybe the first one is, imagine yourself the manager of a team of developers, let's say 10 to 20 people, and you got to look out for your team and where the future's going. What advice would you give for such a manager on how they empower their team to be up on the latest and greatest?
I've seen work out there that sort of suggests, so this is in computer science education context, but they sort of suggested that perhaps like the emphasis now is less on code writing, as I mentioned before, but perhaps on comprehension and being able to review code. And so I could see a world in which, a manager might want to emphasize more on code reviewing skills, being able to kind of catch small errors in generated code, because I think that is going to certainly be an issue because we never know whether these generated code is going to work or not. So I think emphasizing better review practices or code comprehension practices is definitely going to be one thing.
And how about for a student who is learning the craft while simultaneously seeing the craft evolve?
I think there are a couple of things, right? A lot of it's about context. Like, are you a younger student, right? I think there's certainly a lot of value in not using these tools earlier on because you want to kind of learn your programming fundamentals. Some people have sort of compared this to how we might incorporate calculators or something within math education where, at the very beginning, like calculators are banned, at least in my personal experience, right? I learned arithmetic, I learned all the basics. And once I got proficient at it, we started introducing, assistance with calculators and things like that. And I think we could certainly employ a similar approach reasonably with code generation tools like Copilot. Also, what we noted in the studies that people did find that, it was pretty helpful for programming assignments and allowed them to kind of complete the assignments faster. There's certainly like a balance to strike with not robbing people of educational opportunities while allowing them to kind of like maybe get to the learning lessons faster without being bogged down by technical details. The jury's still out. I have not, so this also may be a limitation of what I've seen, but I haven't seen papers out yet. I'm not aware of any papers that have looked at the relationship between like the problem solving abilities or learning strategies of people in CS1 classes, so like the first CS class you might take, versus their usage of Copilot. I would love to see, how Copilot in practice has actually impacted people's ability to actually learn CS concepts. But that would be my first comment, I guess, based on what we know now.
Well, similar question in terms of the survey. You got a lot of good insights of the survey you did. If you could expand it, whether that be, I don't know, it could be longitudinal or more people or something like that, what might be some other interesting research questions you'd like to explore?
I think one potential lost opportunity that we had with the survey is that we didn't actually explicitly capture data on ChatGPT in particular. And I would be so curious to see, like how these natural language interfaces have really transformed people's like development practices. And I think, we conducted this study early this year in 2023, but the landscape has changed so much even within this time period. So I think like something longitudinal, like you said, would be really helpful. And I would also be really interested to see, like how people in companies, like doing a more focused study on how people in companies with proprietary information to protect, how they're kind of like adapting in this late age of programming tools. Like, how many people are using like proprietary versions of Copilot and stuff like that? Yeah, I would be really interested on that as well.
What's next for you?
Honestly, so I'm in my second year of my PhD, which means in practical terms, I don't really know what I want to study yet 100%.
That's where you should be at that stage, by the way, yeah.
Yeah. So, like certainly have one idea that I want to pursue, like I mentioned about, like how do we better align humans with the outputs of these code generation tools? So there's that certainly one direction. But I think another thing that, especially with GPT coming out, is I think thinking about programming not as necessarily through code now, but like there's this new class of developers, I'm sure, that are coming out, which are programming through natural language. And I think there's also some interesting implications, as in maybe not all these people are formally trained programmers. And so like, what does that mean for the state of development? And how do we support these people who are now effectively doing similar things to like programming if they're chaining like outputs from one model to another to do something like to get an output of what they want. So I think that's like one interesting thing that people could study that, I'm thinking about. I'd be really interested in seeing in how we can draw parallels between prompt engineering and software engineering, and seeing whether there's anything that we've learned in the software engineering space tooling wise that might apply in prompt engineering, because I'm sure that there's software developers that might be developing, rather than the code, like these prompts. So like things like IDEs, version controls, like what does that sort of set of development environment like look like in this new era?
It's going to be exciting to see. I'm very optimistic about what might come down the road.
No, certainly me too.
Is there anywhere listeners can follow you online?
You can find me on Twitter, I think at Jenny T. Liang. So that's spelled JennyTliang. And if you want to find more about my work, you can find me at my website. All my other contact info is there as well. So that website is JennyLiang.me. So JennyLiang.me. And I'm always happy to answer questions or chat with people more. So I look forward to your feedback or your questions.
Sounds good. We'll have those links in the show notes as well for listeners to follow up. Jenny, thanks so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me. It was super fun chatting with you.